The human spirit is unconquerable. We are individuals and we are sovereign, born with unlimited potential, gifted from our Creator. Our mission is to break free from the systems that bind us.
I volunteer as tribute.
We strive for peace and prosperity and overcome all challenges, roadblocks, and obstacles. We are empowered because we think for ourselves and we act for ourselves. We are self-reliant and independent, but guided by the wisdom of those who share our values.
What possible difference can I make?
There is no government, no ruler, nor ideas that are able to stop us. We are driven to succeed because we seek political freedom, financial freedom, and spiritual freedom.
It's all for nothing if you don't have freedom.
This is Mike Corbell, and you are listening to the Invictus Mind. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to another edition of the Invictus Mind podcast, the show dedicated to helping you become unconquerable through personal growth, self-improvement, and association. This is your host, Mike Corbell, and I'm happy to be here and happy to lead this discussion about discovering and magnifying our political freedom, financial freedom, and spiritual freedom. As always, our aim is to provide our listeners with the tools to spread this message, so please subscribe and share this show with 3 of your friends. You can find us on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, Anchor, and all the others. You can also check out the videos on YouTube and follow me on any of your favorite social media platforms. Also, if you like any of the show notes, business ideas, money-saving tricks, and information about upcoming events, you can join the Invictus newsletter by texting the word Invictus, INVICTUS, to the number 33777. All right, well, today in the program, I want to take a 50,000-foot view of the state of the world. I want to be able to step outside of the normal paradigm of what we see on a regular basis and truly examine what's going on. We are, in my opinion, going through a transition period in the history of mankind. We are moving from a materialist world to a mystical world, and most people are unaware of such changes. They can only see what is in front of them and almost oblivious as to what government acts and the way it does and why the media reports how it does and why people react in ways that often make no sense. We're going to get a little spiritual today, and so I'm excited to have my guest joining me on the program. This guy I'm going to call a philosopher is the host of an AM/FM radio program called A Neighbor's Choice. His website is aneighborschoice.com, where you can read several of his essays and writings, and his podcast is called Things Hidden. I first discovered his ideas about a year ago, and unfortunately it's taken me almost as long to find his actual program, but since then I've been hooked. I've truly been inspired to get him on the show, so I'd like to welcome to the program Mr. David Gornoski. How you doing, David?
Good. How you doing?
Great. You know, I really appreciate you coming on my show today. I've been really hooked on some of the messages that you've shared with me.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to have a talk with you.
You know, I'm a pretty avid reader, David. And what's interesting is when I hear a good book or a good subject, I want to be able to get the book right away. The last book I read, literally, I just put it down today, was Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces.
Okay, yeah.
And I know that you talk a lot about René Girard, and unfortunately, I have not been able to pick up his book yet. So I thought that maybe we could talk a little bit about some of his teachings, because I know that a lot of your work is based on memetic desire and a scapegoating mechanism.
Yeah. Where do you want to start? There's a lot to it, but it's got a whole cohesion to it.
Well, you know, that book, A Hero with 1,000 Faces, it was really interesting, but it was kind of a difficult read. But I get the gist of it. They talk about the monomyth and how most of the stories, the myths and religions of the world kind of have a basic tenet. They're very similar. And I think most people kind of, they copy this mimetic desire. Maybe you can expound a little bit on what that means.
Yeah, but mimesis means imitation. So mimetic desire means you're imitating the desire of somebody else. So you copy the desires that other people want. So we think we just copy just by fashion or, gestures or stuff like that. But human beings are wired to desire what other people desire, to see what they want and what they want to acquire. And we try to acquire it too. So that's how you learn to, think of certain things and have certain philosophies and It's very fashionable to not believe in God. It's very fashionable to talk about science as a god. They don't know what science is. The people who talk about science don't know anything about science. Dr. Fauci, they don't know anything about mitochondrial health. They don't know anything about the way the metabolic system works in our body. They don't know anything about what vegetable oils do to our mitochondria. Or if they do know, they're evil then, because they don't tell people what to do, which is to stop eating vegetable oils, to stop eating sugar. All those things, of course, are rooted in imitation. People imitate the script. They imitate philosophy. They imitate narratives that they think are powerful and transcendent. And that's what mimetic desire is all about. It's the idea of not only copying rote behavior, but copying what we think other people desire to be. We want to be transcendent. Human beings want to be transcendent. They want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And they're very envious and jealous of other people. And we prop up people around us like gods. That's what we call keeping up with the Joneses.
Mm-hmm.
So the Jones always have a house that's better than yours. They always have a car that's better than yours. They always have a relationship that's better than yours. They always have a school that's better than yours. They always have children better behaved than yours. They always have something better than you, and you idolize them, and you're jealous of them, and you envy them. You want to be them. And so you desire what they desire, or what you perceive them desiring, so that you can become them. Remember that guy that killed John Lennon?
Mm-hmm.
What was his name? Brinkley or something, was it?
Yeah, Hinckley.
Something, yeah. So this guy, he said, when they asked him, why'd you do it? He said, I wanted to be him. I wanted to be him, right? And you think about all those creepers that stalk celebrities, and they want to be the celebrity, they're sometimes and that's what Rene Girard says, the line between adoration and murder is very thin. We adore people to death. We adore politicians to death. We adore our heroes from childhood to death. Sometimes we adore our children to death. We adore all kinds of people. We idolize them too much, and we smother them in our attempt to try to become them, right? And so, and that is something that Rene Girard was looking at, is this obsessive desire to be. Remember what Shakespeare said, to be or not to be? That is the question. Right now, we are operating on a Cartesian model, which is I think, therefore I am. But that's not a proper model of the universe. The real model of the universe is to be or not to be. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Which is more biblically based. Christianity and modernism and materialism, they're all about I think blank, therefore I am, right? I think this doctrine, therefore I am a Christian. I think this church is the correct church, therefore I am a Christian. I think this idea, therefore I'm a libertarian. I think this, therefore I'm a good person. But that's not what reality is about. Reality is about becoming. It's about becoming. And who are we going to be? It's a state of being that we're looking after, and so much of what we look at in mimetic desire. So the simple way to look at mimetic desire is to look at two children fighting over the same toy. And, the first child picks up the toy, doesn't really care about it. Then the next child says, hey, I really want that toy. Tries to pull the toy away from the first child. First child didn't care about the toy until the second child wants it. Now the first child really wants it too. See, that's mimetic desire.
Right. And as you said, everyone has their own identity, but they think that their identity is correct. And then they're willing to fight and die for that identity, which is a great cause of strife everywhere.
Right.
So it's funny. I was driving yesterday, and you asked me offline, how things are in Chicago, and I would say that 98% of people are still compliant to the mask mandates here in Chicago. Yeah. And it broke my heart because I'm seeing it was about 3:00 and the school had just gotten out, and I was driving somewhere, and I saw about 100 kids all over the road wearing their masks, and I'm wondering if there's one brave enough to not wear it, what would happen to that kid? Would he get teased? Would he get scorned? But everybody just wants to copy, and I'm not sure what the heck's going on with that.
Well, what's going on with that is that's human beings. They've always been that way. You just didn't have a crisis to see this clearly. That's all. Human beings are always like that. They copy more than the animals do. And cities are hive minds of copycats. So cities tend to attract the most imitative, mimetically owned minds possible. I'm not, there's also great innovators and so forth in cities, but when you think about the visual of building building so high that you can stack people on top of each other, that's a mimetic contagion already, just visually. It's like a little hive mind, it literally looks like a hive. It's like they have to be so close to one another that they have to stack a building up to the sky just to to warehouse human beings on top of each other. That is going to be an environment ripe for mimetic undifferentiation, which people lose their mind in the sense of groupthink contagion. They're just, and so, yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean that, all human beings are mimetic. That's what makes us great too, but the problem is, cities tend to attract an overabundance of the worst type of imitation. When these cities decline, they just become striving after social status, striving after stupidity, and so forth. If the television tells them this is what you do, they want to do it. If the television tells them this is what you got to look like, they want to do it. They don't have any ability to say, hey, I don't care. I'm just going to do what's right. They don't care. They just are told this is what you put them at, like stupid Joe Biden. I mean, this is a guy who spent 50 years of his, career bombing every person of color around the globe he could find. And this man is paraded as a man of social justice. This is a man who spent his entire career marginalizing vulnerable communities with the war on drugs, the crime bill, militarization of police. And this guy's presented by the television as a hero of justice. Only an idiot would believe the television. You have to be so shriveled up in your rational processing to look at the television and it tells you this man spent 50 years locking up people of color. This is a man who spent 50 years bombing people of color. This man will give you Black Lives Matter justice. Are you kidding me? Only an idiot, mimetically owned so bad. And I don't mean idiot like their IQ. I mean, they're foolishly locked in a contagion of groupthink so bad that they cannot see straight,
Right, and the TV itself has short-term memory because they won't tell you all the things that Joe Biden has done for 50 years, just what he's saying right now.
Right, and I don't mind if people want to take vaccines, take all 3 vaccines, go have at it. Why can't they push? I mean, that's the next thing. They'll have to say, you get the special star student if you get all 3 vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. Then you're the superstar student. But the television tells you must get this. There is no other way, no other herd immunity available except through these vaccines. And then you say, wait a second, aren't you guys the same media companies that tell us all about Pfizer being sued, Johnson & Johnson being sued for criminal things, all kinds of stuff they've gone through, Bextra, Vioxx, Celebrex. Mm-hmm. All these drugs have all kinds of terrible health effects and they hide the information and they have a revolving door relationship with the regulators. And we're told over and over again for decades, CNBC, CBS, ABC, they've been telling us all the crooked stuff that these companies have done. And they think that we have a goldfish memory where we can't remember that. You know what I'm saying? It's like a television show. Season 1, this character's a good guy. Season 2, they're a villain, or vice versa. Season 1, they're a villain. They bring them back in season 2. Now they're somehow a good guy, and you don't get a good enough explanation as to how that transition happened. Right. Usually with a good story is you're supposed to see a character arc. You're supposed to see, they started off evil, but slowly they develop their character to the point where they become redeemed. That's not what the television does. They're just like, yeah, they did this. They pushed us into opioids. They pushed us into Celebrex. They pushed us into all these toxic drugs. They had criminal things. They had hidden stuff. They had payouts. They had biases. And then episode 2, they're wonderful. They've got vaccines. Go get them or you're dead. What did that happen? How low information do you have to be to buy into that narrative? You know what I mean? They don't even have a good story as to how they redeem themselves to be able to push a drug in an emergency order. And remember, the television was telling us during the debates that if Trump was reelected, those vaccines that he was developing would be no good. Remember that? Kamala Harris said, I'm not taking that Trump vaccine. That's the same vaccine she's pushing on everybody now. It's the same thing. She just won the election, so now it's magically good. It takes a really programmed groupthink owned mind to buy into this stuff,
Yeah, exactly. And it's just it's absolutely crazy. Like you said, there's no narrative. It's just one day this is what everyone does. The next day everyone does something different. And the election just keeps going. Are you familiar with a guy by the name of Vin Armani?
No, I'm not. Who's that? Wait, who's that? No.
So Vin Armani, he's a podcaster. He's been on several shows. He actually wrote a book called Render Unto Caesar. But he's talking about how we're actually now entering into what we call the dim age. A state of mysticism. That's kind of how I started the program here, David. We have a material world that we were in, and all of a sudden now, by magic, people are just through technology and through the TV and through media channels, they're just believing things that are unreal or untruthful, and we're kind of going through a transition. What I think is interesting is that people. It doesn't matter what. It doesn't matter who the source is. It's just if it's on TV, that's what you see. If it's been told by some expert, that's what you see. Whether there's a reality to it or not.
If Dr. Fauci told you that if your kid tests positive for COVID, you need to put them in the garage so that they're not in the main house with the air circulation, and put them with a dog saucer, like a pet food saucer. And put their food in that water, pour the water in the dog saucer so you don't touch the dishes that they have. You keep your dishes for the rest of the family. And if your kid gets COVID, you put them in the garage for 2 weeks and you check on them and change their water in the dog saucer so as to not touch all the other dishes that everybody else is using. Millions of people would do it. If Joe Biden told them we're going to create a new policy where we're going to provide unlimited housing, free government housing, free government provided meals. We're going to provide labor programs, and we're going to provide free government health care. We're going to expand our federal prisons, and you can join the federal prison, and you'll have a work program for 15 cents an hour. You'll have 3 square meals provided to you by the government. You'll get free education. You'll have library access. You'll have gym exercise. You will have full security. You will be taken care of. You will have full government health care. And they said, we're just going to expand the prisons to allow lots of people who want to come in here, and you can be a part of this system at no cost of your own. Millions of people would sign up for that, because NBC and ABC and CBS, who always dutifully support whatever the media, whatever the official DC establishment wants, they will market that as, hey, isn't this amazing? It's a total reformation of our society. Now we don't have to work. So this is an option for people who want to be a part of a new society, a great new, what was that other one called? The Great Society. This is going to be the better society, the greatest society. And it will be everything taken care of. Millions of people would go along with that. That's what memetic groupthink does. It is human desire, basically picked up by other people, and it's based on how much momentum the contagion of avalanche of desire is moving. It's like, it's an avalanche and it has momentum, and so if millions of people want something, it makes it harder for other people to resist going along with that.
Reminds me of the book A Brave New World by Huxley.
Yeah.
As long as people keep getting fed their soma, then everything will be okay.
Yeah.
David, a lot of your podcasts, some of the things you talk about, I want to get a little bit into some of the scapegoating that you talk about. I think one of your episodes recently, you were talking about this world that we live in is based on the Christian principle. The Western civilization is heavily influenced by Christianity, even though in today's world, it seems like people are forgetting their God. They're forgetting, why those principles were set up the way they were, but they're still imitating, and they're still creating scapegoats for everything. Can you tell a little bit about what the scapegoat mechanism is?
Yeah. So the scapegoat mechanism is the idea that human beings, if we're copying each other, that's good when it's positive. But it turns bad when we copy negative stuff like hate and anger, violence and aggression. So if human beings are like little magnetic copycat machines, and that's true, mirror neurons and other things suggest that's true. Our ability to make tools suggests that's true. All innovation comes from good imitation. All innovation comes from good, positive mimetic desire, mimetic behavior. And then the worst stuff of humanity comes from negative mimetic desire, where you have tit for tat violence, right? So animals, they don't wipe. Do you know of any animal that goes on an intentional genocide?
I can't think of one.
Lions will kill their rival males, cubs, but they don't obliterate everything they can find, from the rival camp. They will just kill the cubs so that the lionesses go into heat again, so they can mate with them and get the lion lineage going.
Mm-hmm.
But generally speaking, it's human beings that go on genocide. We'll wipe out the whole village, the whole tribe, the whole nation, and go back and forth for generations. So the question is, how do we survive if that's how we are? Like, why are we still here? How come we didn't cease to exist, to get extinguished from our own violence? And Girard said that, if you look at the earliest societies, we see the record of human sacrifice, of whenever there's a festival or ever there's a time of seasonal change or there's a celebration of the crops or whatever, that there would be a sacrifice that would be offered, And so he's saying, well, how come all these religions that in these societies that don't know each other are all doing the same sacrificial rituals? Did they all hang out at one point and decide on doing this? Or, is this something that humans stumbled upon to kind of like coincidental evolution, happening at the same time? Social evolution is what I'm talking about.
If you study history and study religion, they'll talk about how man was instructed to actually perform sacrifice. And of course, Jesus Christ is supposed to be the similitude of that. And at the end of his life, he was saying the sacrifice is now done, but people still continue to do that. They have a desire to still sacrifice.
Yeah, the first sacrifice is when Cain kills Abel, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we saw just recently on TV, we had the scapegoat, this cop, right? This guy Derek Chauvin, he was the latest sacrifice. So now all this political violence will now end because of the latest scapegoat. But I don't think that's going to happen
anymore, because we don't agree on sacrifices, because some people think Derek Chauvin is the scapegoat and some people think that George Floyd is the scapegoat.
Mm-hmm.
You see, in the ancient society communities, they didn't have dueling scapegoats. They had a consensus on who was the villain. We can't agree on who the villain is anymore. You see, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why is that? Why do we not agree on who the villain is anymore?
Well, we all have our own identities, and so we all have our own different person who is against that identity. And
how do we get to that point? See, that's the question that Gerard's asking. How do we get to that point? How do we get to the point where we have our own personal conception of what's the good guy and who's the bad guy?
I'm not sure. I wish we could figure that one out.
Jesus is the personhood revolution. Jesus creates the personhood concept.
Okay.
Right? Because society kills the one. The collective kills the one. And when the collective kills the one, that's been happening since the dawn of time. But when Jesus does it, the gospel writers write it from the perspective of the one instead of the many. And from that standpoint, you get to see the birth of personhood. The idea of the individual becomes something that will be sacred. Before that, the community was the sacred. The community's shared values, the collective body was the sacred. But then when Jesus comes into the history story, he performs the role of the scapegoat. But instead of it being told from the winners of history, which was the crowd's perspective, it's told from the victim's perspective, which is the individual person. And ever since that story is shared throughout history, it contaminates the old order of the many defining reality, and it orients it back to the one defining reality, the individual. Mm-hmm. And that's where the West gets this unique concept of individual and personhood and so forth. But that was because of Jesus's story that infected the stories of all the world. all the other stories had mythology written from the vantage point of the collective. And the collective always makes sure that their narrative is rock solid. So back in the day, if the George Floyd thing had happened thousands and thousands of years ago, because Derek Chauvin represented the establishment, the police, there would be no disagreement on who was the villain and who was the good guy. But because of Jesus destroying that unanimity of scapegoating, now there's scrambled narratives. Now some people think George Floyd was the innocent sacrificial lamb and Derek Chauvin was the oppressor. In fact, I would say most people in America tend to lean to that perspective. Then the other smaller group of people said, no, Derek Chauvin was a sacrificial lamb and George Floyd was just, whatever, he was deified by the media. But see, that's a scrambled narrative because Jesus destroyed the unanimity of myth making. You just got to understand that the Gospels is a media phenomenon. If you take one thing away from this show today, what I'm saying today, I'm talking to everybody. The gospel is a media technology, and it informs all technologies that it percolates in. It informs our cell phone cameras, the way we take cameras, the way we talk about things, the way we talk about radio, podcasting. It informs the narratives of what we're capturing and sharing with one another. And it does not allow for unanimity to be bound together through shared sacrifice anymore. Remember when Caiaphas said we had to kill Jesus, he said, it's better that one man die than the whole nation perish. That's the heart of politics. That's the heart of government.
Right.
And so the Bible is deconstructing politics. But you have to see it. If you're part of groupthink, you won't let it apply to your own contemporary time. But when you start, and we're all part of groupthink to some degree or another, we all get locked up into herd mentality. But when you start to become more self-aware of that, then you can say, oh, that makes sense. It's better that one man die than the whole nation perish. And that doesn't just include actual killing people. It can also include the idea of social death, because you put someone in prison, that's a social death. That's kind of like dying, being locked in a warehouse with violence and assault and terror and PTSD and all the horrible things that go along in that environment for a nonviolent crime is another way of bearing false witness against your neighbor, by the way. If you put someone in a cage, you're basically showing, how they say actions speak louder than words?
Right.
So your actions perform false witness against a neighbor. Let's say they were doing a nonviolent thing, or they'd had a suspended license or whatever, something like that. And then you're going to put them in a cage with violent gangs where they can't leave. And if they leave, they get shot by the security. What you're doing is you're performing false witness against your neighbor. You're treating them like they're violent when they're not. And so by doing that, you are shaming yourself every time we do that as a society. And that's why we have so much guilt and shame built into our narratives today. And politicians try to redirect that shame and guilt into one people group or another. They don't want that shame and guilt to go back on the individual for self-examination about the temptation of human nature when given ultimate power. You see? So they want to quarantine it into, it's the liberals, it's white people, it's males, toxic males, it's immigrants, it's Muslims, it's some group, but it can't be all of us. Because if all human nature is indicted by our temptation to use absolute power in wicked ways, guess what that means? That means we have to repent of all this state worship. And that's the one thing human beings don't want to do, because they want to maintain their prerogative to use preemptive violence to harm those who they're afraid of or who they're jealous of.
You think that's gotten worse over the years? You mentioned, obviously, you go back 1,000 years, and people wouldn't think that George Floyd would be the victim, would be the good guy or anything like that. But do you think that this is kind of accelerated?
I think it's a good thing. See, I think it's a good thing that George Floyd has defenders.
Okay.
It doesn't mean, because I'm not telling you one way or another which story is correct. I'm just telling you in order to defeat tyranny, you need to have different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a totalitarian perspective, you don't have anything, right? So if you were in the ancient, Incan Empire, when they sacrificed somebody, there's no disagreeing opinion. You didn't debate that at the lunchroom that day. You didn't say, hey, when that priest ripped that man's heart out on the temple, I don't think he deserved that. I think he was a great guy. You didn't get to have that perspective. Right. There was one perspective, total perspective. The sacred permeated everything. Mm-hmm. You didn't get Fox News and One American News and CNN. You didn't get all these. You had one perspective, and that's it. You might have personal doubts in your head back then, but those were not allowed to be shared as a different narrative. And so in order for tyranny to fall apart, you have to have decentralized perspectives, decentralized narratives. The downside of that is that it can be very chaotic and confusing as to what's true. That's what you're referring to, I think, as the mystical time, right? That you have all these different feelings and postmodern subjective experiences or something. Is that what you're talking about?
Correct. Postmodernism is everywhere. And then, obviously we want to talk about decentralized communication, which is, everyone knows that as the freedom of speech that we have in America. But it seems that that's been going away, or at least they're trying to put the kibosh on that right now. We don't want to be able to have freedom of speech anymore, because if you think the wrong narrative, then you're either you're canceled, or you're shunned, or you're basically just eliminated from that ability.
Yeah, I mean that's a return to the normal of most of human history. Today's politically correct speech codes are a vestige of ritual human incantations and mythology. And what I mean by that is there was a shared narrative. Odin demands this, right? Mm-hmm. Zeus demands this. And this is the story why this is required of us. And you didn't get to have a minority report to say, well, no, I don't agree with that. Zeus is not real. You didn't get to have that. It was just, this is the standard culture and this is the way it has to be. What the gods were actually projections of the human culture itself. Mm. See, I told you before, we don't want to take responsibility for our own violence. So we have to quarantine it. Today, we quarantine it into political rivals. It's the left, it's the right, it's the Antifa, it's the neo-Nazis, it's the Trump voters, it's we're always trying to push the shame of all evil into one group. But back in the old ancient world, before Jesus broke the sacrificial old order, you would project your violence into the sky. So you'd say, we had to sacrifice this guy because the gods demanded it. But the gods didn't demand it. The gods are actually just the crowd.
Right.
The crowd, what they call the wrath of the gods is actually the wrath of the crowd swept up in mimetic frenzy of hate or fear. And it's called the wrath of the gods because if you don't appease that crowd's going to turn on itself and you're going to have hell on earth. So that psychological experience and fear of hell on earth, of all against all, is projected into the sky as the wrath of the gods. Hmm. And so, before you had ritual sacrifice.
I still got you, sorry.
Before you had ritual sacrifice, you had the primitive, archaic scapegoat mechanism, mm-hmm. which is the unconscious, accidental stumbling upon a common victim. And that's, again, everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else. You're the problem. You're the problem. You're the problem. You're mean. You're stupid. You're dumb. You're evil. Bad, bad, bad. And all of a sudden, that imitation, mimetic desire, turns on one common person. It's that person's fault. He's a witch. He's a monster. He's a deplorable.
Right.
And everybody agrees, hey, I think you're right. That guy is the monster. And usually a scapegoat is someone that can't defend themselves because if you're very popular, they might defend you. That's just going to create a war. If you select somebody who's got a lot of friends, they're going to stand in the way and say, you don't kill him. He's not a problem. He's great. So whoever gets the scapegoat killing is someone who has lost his popularity. Maybe they were the god, maybe they were the king, and now they're not as popular anymore. Maybe they were maybe they were a pet. Maybe the person was a peasant or a disabled person, someone who had a disability, someone who would not have a lot of social standing to fight back. And it becomes very easy to believe that it's just like, if everybody says someone is guilty, it's harder to say no.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right. And so you think about the story of Christ and the politicians. Pontius Pilate wanted to appease the crowd.
Yeah.
He washed his hands clean, even though he couldn't find any guilt in the man of Jesus himself, but he didn't want to have a revolt among the Jews. So he washed his hands clean because that tyranny of the mob would have done something bad. Might have ended his reign as governor, or caused war in the land.
Yeah. So he actually let go of Barabbas. And the earliest gospel texts record Barabbas' name as Yeshua Barabbas.
Right.
So there's two Jesuses there. Jesus, the nonviolent one, and Jesus, the revenge guy. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, and everyone was upset, or they didn't accept Christ as a savior because they expected him to be a conqueror. And what's interesting is that he was nonviolent. He was peaceful man. He didn't preach violence at all. And so when people, even Christians today, they want to use violence to justify their own ends, they're
still imitating the wrong. They're imitating Barabbas, not the real. There's two Jesuses. The earliest Gospels record Barabbas' name as Yeshua Barabbas. Bar means of, Abbas, the Father. Jesus of the Father. Two sons of the Father. Two Jesus sons of the Father. And the crowd has asked, which one do you choose? Do you choose the one who says nonviolence, respect for the individual, or do you choose the one who says, let's get revenge by force? And the crowd says, let's save the guy who wants vengeance and let's kill the guy who says, forgive our enemies.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So we've been choosing the wrong Jesus ever since in some sense, Even Christians, they always go off to war. They go off to this. They go off to that. And that's not the right Jesus. That's Jesus Barabbas. That's the other Jesus. See what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a lot of people within the Christian anarchy circle who want nothing to do with the government because they understand the violence and the force behind that, right? And I have this conversation with some of my friends all the time about whether or not liberty is something that we should violently defend. And I'm like, I don't think that we should violently defend liberty. I think that we should we should peacefully go after the things that we want. Liberty being a force that God has given to us, right? But I often ask, like, what is worth dying for? What kind of life do we want to have? People seem to be afraid of dying in this world, unless they come under attack, and they feel like they're coming under attack in every angle.
Yeah, that the fear of death is what permeates a lot of the problems of our time.
Right. So you talk a lot about on your show some of the differences between the left and the right, as opposed to this world that we live in based on the Christian model. You talk a little bit about how the left, I think you said, is more of an aesthetic version of the Christian story, and the right. is more materialist.
Well, the right is more of a classic scapegoating, and the left is more of the Christian flavored scapegoating, you know? So the right is more prone to say, you know, don't question institutions of tradition, don't question, you know, police actions. Whenever there's a disputed shooting, the right always says, yeah, they always default and say, yeah, the police was right, the guy who got shot was wrong. And so that goes back to more of the pagan approach. You know, in Rome, if there was a Roman soldier killed somebody in a horrible way or a you know, brutal way, you know, the society would not say, well, let's see what he did. Let's make sure we get the body cam footage of the Roman soldier to make sure that he didn't do this improperly. No, they just said, no, whatever Rome did is representative of Rome's glory. And this person who was killed by a Roman soldier, of course, they had it coming to them. So that's the classic pagan way of looking at things. The right tends to lean towards that perspective. And the left is more into an aesthetic that looks more like Christianity, where they're saying, no, we want to know the perspective of the person being accused. We want to know the perspective of the person who's oppressed, marginalized, outcast. That's the perspective we're going to be biased towards no matter what. And the problem with that is of course, that creates just another excuse to have revenge scapegoating, right? So now we have to tax the rich because the oppressed don't have as much, or we have to, you know, put violent laws to cage people for speech violations because people who are oppressed may be hurt by certain speech. And we have to, you know, always destroy anybody who prefers things like family and so forth, because family, not everybody gets to have an intact nuclear family. And so therefore we have to defend those who don't get to have that nuclear family by attacking the idea of a family being a good thing, right? So the left is always obsessed, you know, or, you know, engineering departments, the graduate students tend to be like what, 70, 80% men. And so they say, well, that's not fair. So we need to have equity where we can replace that and make 70 to 80% of engineering graduates become women, right? We need to make that, you know, so that's the only, it has to balance out anything that's not equal, right? And so the left tends to be a little bit more Christian in their aesthetic, but they ethically turn to sacrificial violence. But the reason why the left is always winning the culture against the right is that the left, again, imitates the aesthetic of Christianity, and Jesus is in the driver's seat of history. So whichever brand of sacred violence most effectively imitates the winner of history, which is Jesus, that brand will be the one that wins the day through the generations. So the right is reactionary. Jesus is not a reactionary. The left has a vision for the future. They want to go somewhere. They have a vision about where society should go. But that is an all-powerful state with corporations and so forth doing everything in a kind of hive mind global utopia. But that actually imitates the idea of the kingdom of heaven more than the right does. The right is just more like, hey, slow down on that idea. Don't do that so fast. So that's why the right is never in the leadership of culture.
Right.
They just slow things down. They say, oh, don't create a United Nations. Oh, we got a United Nations. Don't create a Department of Education. Oh, we got a Department of Education. Don't, you know, do this or that. They just slow it down, but they're not the leaders of the culture. The right just slows it down. They're just sitting there. They're like a backseat driver that tells the left, hey, watch it. You're going too fast. Slow down. So who's in the back seat is the child. Who's in the driver's seat is the one who's moving everything. That's the leader. And that's the left, right? But the left, unfortunately, act like emotional children because they can't handle their emotions. So that's where we're at today, because the right doesn't understand the aesthetic of the gospel. They choose the aesthetic of the pagan sacred before the gospel, even though they claim to have the metaphysics of Christ, but they still have the aesthetic of the pagan sacred, of the idea of there is a hierarchy and you do not question the hierarchy and you do not upset the tradition of the hierarchy. When I say the pagan sacred, it doesn't mean everything in pagan sacred culture is bad. It just means that's what the right tends to be aesthetically.
Right. They're definitely more in tune with the hierarchical structure of things, you know. It's just funny because I always wonder what that word conservative actually means. It's more of a methodology than they're trying to conserve anything. But the right is notorious with justice and law and order, and they always want to make sure people are following the rules. And it seems like the left, they're not too in tune with the rules. They always wanted to change things. Obviously, that's what the word progressivism means right there. So,
was that what Jesus came to do? Just react to change?
No, he didn't. He came to declare what the truth was.
Right. But he wanted to take things to a direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to make society go somewhere, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So that would mean the left is more like Christ in terms of their aesthetic. But unfortunately, because they're more like Christ, they have more cultural power, which makes them become more drunk in power, and they do a lot of violent stuff with that. But that's why we have Joe Biden in the White House after 50 years of dropping bombs on people of color and caging people of color. And yet he's being told that he is the hero that will help us bring racial reconciliation. That's the left doing what the left does, which is, they use the aesthetic of concern for victims. The left has great rhetoric. Remember what Barack Obama said? We're going to be the change that we're looking for. We're going to be the change. The seas will part. The moon will come out. The oceans will rise and the people will have their change. Yes, we can. We can do it. That sounds so good to the soul because it sounds like Christ stuff. It sounds like concern for victims. It sounds like liberation. And the left is very good at rhetoric that is steeped in the Christian concern for victims, but they orient that rhetoric towards authoritarian sacrificial purposes. And the right is not as effective because they tend to be the reactionary pagan sacred alternative. But because Jesus is the history change agent, not the pagan sacred, the right always loses. Because even though they have the metaphysics of Christianity, they talk about we believe in God and all that stuff, but the aesthetic that they represent does not imbue it with that Christian energy. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That's so important to think about, the aesthetic of the gospel.
Absolutely. And then you have the small minority of people, we'll just call them the libertarians, who, espouse individualism and nonviolence. But most of them, I don't want to classify any group of people, obviously, but a lot of them don't even understand some of the background we had, the idea of where Western civilization was built, the principle of Christianity.
Right. That's why they don't, because they are Cartesians. I think blank, therefore I am. Right. They don't understand that human beings didn't pop out like that. That it was a human cultural, anthropological process that human beings have had for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. What is the libertarian response to ritual cannibalism? I mean, that's the origins of human culture. People would share a meal together around a fire, and it happened to be human. And that's why Jesus says, eat my body, drink my blood, because he's bringing us back to that primordial moment that human culture was steeped in, which is, again, remember, mimetic desire is the desire to be, to the point where people desire so much they would eat their neighbor. Isn't that terrible? But, Jesus brings us back to that by saying, eat my body, drink my blood, to call us to remember where we came from. Mimetic desire, the desire to consume someone's very being to the point where you eat them physically. Goodness gracious. So the libertarians don't want to know that Jesus is the founder of the liberty movement. And I say that in broad speaking because I think a lot of libertarians do believe that. But I'm just speaking rhetorically here, that some libertarians don't want to acknowledge that Jesus is the founder of the liberty movement because they don't want to see how the state and religion are intertwined together, that the state came out of religion, and that the idea of a secular space is a Christian doctrine. So everything that they hold to is actually just, derivative of Christianity, but they're so afraid of the metaphysics because they've been told by mimetic fashion today that, oh, if you talk about Jesus, you're talking about a fairy tale and Super Mario. This is a fictional character, Harry Potter stuff. And so they've just, that's the fashion of the time that they're born in.
Mm-hmm.
And so they think they're rugged individualists because they Google the nap, but they don't understand how much of a part of the groupthink society that they're in, because they're still going along with the same biases of our age, that Jesus is a myth or Christians are hypocrites. Well, of course the Christians are hypocrites. I mean, it's very difficult to imitate Jesus. Try it for one day. It's very hard, you know?
Exactly. So it's interesting as we're witnessing this, I don't want to be a fatalist, but I don't know how much more this country is going to take before it just we have massive revolution or revolts. I mean, in my lifetime, things have just dramatically gotten worse and worse, and people are forgetting their backgrounds, but they're imitating everything they see. What do you think is going to happen in long term?
Well, I think I have an optimistic approach to the long term. I think in the long term that human history is moving in the right direction. And I would just say it like this. You know that story when Jesus is coming into Jerusalem and they say, and they're praising his name as the chosen one, he's the hero.
Mm-hmm.
And the authorities say, tell those people to be quiet. And he says, when they are silent, the stones will cry out, right?
Right.
Well, the stones will cry out is a reference to Habakkuk chapter 2. Okay, so I'm going to read Habakkuk. I'm going to read from that portion real quick. This gives you my understanding of the future. So Habakkuk chapter 2 is a prophet named Habakkuk who's challenging a wicked king of his time. And he says, woe to him who piles up stolen goods. Have you heard of people that steal goods lately? The state. And makes himself wealthy by extortion. Have you heard of that?
Oh, yeah.
How long must this go on? Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey because you have plundered many nations. The peoples who are left will plunder you. For you have shed human blood and you have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life. Here it is. This is the point that Jesus quotes. The stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. In the stones of cornerstone rituals, they would lay human beings sacrificed for the preservation of the beginning of a new city or a new town or a new dam. This happened all over the world, in Japan, ancient Germany, Jericho, all over the place. They would lay a human sacrifice at the cornerstone ritual to bless and consecrate the new city or the new wall with the blood of an innocent victim. So he's talking about this here. The stones of the wall will cry out, saying, woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. That's sacrifice. That's the scapegoat mechanism. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the water covers the sea. You see that?
So it sounds like the future is going to be repeating exactly what the scriptures are saying. We're looking for that sacrifice, but long term, who's going to win in the end, right?
Well, look at it. It says, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So when Jesus takes this quote, this is where I'm going to show you this happened in history. Mm-hmm. Because the next week, the crowd was silent. They turned their back on him. And the stones of the wall cried out, meaning the hidden victims of every nation have been speaking out. And history is haunted by scapegoats, human sacrifices. And that includes our wars, that includes our unjust justice system, and all the other things that go along with it. And so what this passage is talking about is saying, when Jesus has the crowd silent, right? When the crowd goes silent, we have been hearing victims in history ever since. And the knowledge of the Lord will fill the earth as the water covers the sea. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
That means ever since Jesus died on the cross, the knowledge of God has been filling the earth as water fills the sea. That's a lot. So that means that, in my opinion, history is going to a better understanding of the concern for victims and nonviolence and all the things that Jesus talks about. Jesus says God desires mercy, not sacrifice. Jesus says the meek shall inherit the earth. You know, all these things are going to be fulfilled in history, I believe. That doesn't mean it's going to get perfectly better with no problems. It just means that things are going to go up and down, but in the big picture, they're going in the right direction, I believe.
Right.
The question we have to ask ourselves is Jesus saving the world? And will he save the world? Or is he a failure?
Well, I think you and I can both come to terms that he wasn't a failure, but we're witnessing some of this stuff going on right now. And as long as we get good messages out there and continue to do his bidding, like he says, proselytize the message, then things are getting better. You know, I think when I say that we're heading towards a transition of mysticism, right? I think that people finding their faith, returning to that the idea of having a savior come and restore all things. I think that's going to be important going forward.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
David, I want to appreciate the conversation that we had. And I'd love to be able to chat with you again in the future, but you know, I'm not as versed in scriptures as I should be, but I really think that there are some great teachings there. And I want to thank you for your work that you've done. I do encourage people to look you up. Why don't you go ahead and plug your show and some of the other work that you're doing?
Well, our show's called A Neighbor's Choice. It airs Monday through Friday from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Our website is aneighborschoice.com. That's aneighborschoice.com. And you can also find us by searching for David Gornoski on YouTube, where my channel is. You'll see my daily radio show and my podcast interviews. And then you can also look for us on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for David Gornoski, because I put both my radio show, A Neighbor's Choice, and the podcast things hidden under the same title of just my name, so people can find it easy.
All right. Well, thank you very much, David. I appreciate that. Stick on the line for 1 second. I'll just end the recording here.
All right. Thank you.